It was fun-filled and festive four-night event of a re-energized Democratic Party rediscovering its long-held patriotism, and a self-realization of a November election's victory was not a far-fetched idea after all, and within reach as the party's standard-bearer was officially anointed. The convention kicked off with the president declaring his full trust and confidence in his vice president to run in his stead and hopefully run the country beginning January next year. Then the Obamas capped the second night with soaring speeches the crowd couldn't get enough of as well, as the roll call that turned into a fun and dance party for all the nation's delegates. Oprah headlined the third night with her well-received common sense over nonsense speech, and then punctuated by the moving acceptance speech of Harris's running mate, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. And the female presidential candidate officially accepted the nomination on the final night of the convention with her stirring 37-minute "We're never going back" speech, and set the stage for the spring toward the finish line in the race for the white in November. And to give us more details on the 2024 Democratic National Convention, we have with us here tonight VOA correspondent Kane Farabaugh. Good morning, Kane, all the way in Illinois.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here to talk to you.
Great. So let's talk about what happened at the DNC. Kamala Harris's acceptance speech last Friday was a little over an hour shorter than Donald Trump's. It was personal, patriotic, and covered policies both in the economy and foreign relations. Kane, do you think Kamala rose to the occasion and met the moment in her speech? And on the flip side, what do you think voters needed to hear that she may have left out?
She certainly rose to the moment. I think that there was a lot of focus on whether or not she was going to address the war in Gaza, and it was definitely a part of her speech. She really took to task addressing that issue. She said that the United States is an ally and supports Israel, while it also supports the Palestinians and their right to self-determination. And I think that that was probably a key moment that it was sort of speculated that she might address when she was giving her speech. And ultimately, she did speak to that. Voters in the United States are primarily concerned about several key issues. That is the economy and border security, and the future on how whatever president wins the White House will address those concerns. Inflation has been high. That means that the cost of everything here in the United States, for groceries, gasoline, everything is higher than it was. And American voters need to hear from each of the presidential candidates, but Kamala Harris in particular, about what she wants to do to help Americans deal with what they see as rising costs for everything. And also, Republican nominee, former President Donald Trump, has really been taking both President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris to task for what he phrases or views as a border crisis, a border security crisis, in which there is an influx of people crossing the border here in the United States. And so I think that these are the things that, at least on the campaign trail in the coming weeks, voters are going to be keenly interested in tuning in to hearing how she'll address some of those concerns.
Okay, now that second night at the DNC was an eye-opener with a dance party roll call, care of DJ Cassidy, Little John coming out of nowhere for the Georgia delegate announcement, and so on. All this preceding Michelle Obama's inspiring hope, making a comeback speech. But let's face it, Hollywood star power, or even bringing Taylor Swift in the mix, won't really translate into votes in the heartland, let alone in the swing states. Many are of the opinion that the surefire way to victory for the Democrats and the GOP campaign, for that matter, is a formula of more boots on the ground. This means knocking on doors and the top tickets from both parties making their case in person. Any thoughts about this?
Well, I wouldn't be so sure that having Taylor Swift as a headliner in one of your campaign appearances isn't going to translate into votes. I think it might, actually. But the reality is, you're right. This is definitely something that the campaign needs to address. You need to have that army of volunteers basically out there campaigning for you, registering people to vote, getting people there enthusiastic about making sure that they turn out to vote. In the United States, Republicans are going to vote for Republicans, Democrats are going to vote for Democrats, but there's this larger part of the electorate, perhaps anywhere from 50 to 60% of people that are not affiliated with either party. They're independent voters. They're voters that haven't made up their minds yet. And those are the people who will determine the outcome of the election. So each of the candidates needs to make sure that not only do those people turn out to vote, but that they are motivated and enthusiastic to vote for their candidate. And so for Democrats, because you've had this week of prime time exposure, across all social media platforms, on television, this is the opportunity for them to express a message in prime time to the American public. And that is setting the stage effectively for what the rest of the campaign brings. We're less than 80 days, maybe even less than 75 days now to November 5th. And so it's critical for each of these parties to motivate the voters to get out there to vote. You do that by having boots on the ground and getting people to physically touch someone to say, register to vote here. Please make sure that you turn out on this date to vote. Here's your polling location. And it's even more critical even in the next couple of weeks, because while we're talking about an election date in November, the reality is early balloting and mail-in balloting begins in some states as early as September, mid-September, September 17th. So, the window to get that message across, to get people out there to vote is very short, narrow, and it'll all happen very quickly.
Okay, let's move on to Kamala's interesting relationship with the press. Dodging the press has worked for Vice President Kamala Harris this past month, but when do you think she would actually indulge or engage with the media? Or will she continue to keep her distance until after the upcoming September debates to avoid flip-flopping on issues like her stand on the border, fracking, defunding the police, and other issues?
She hasn't really had one of these, big press conferences like former President Donald Trump has had here in the last couple of weeks. And, to be fair, she really hasn't had to. All of the publicity, all of the attention on her announcement and subsequently President Biden's endorsement of her, and then the Democratic National Convention, all of this has provided a platform for her to get messaging out, for her to be able to speak to the public, for there to be this sort of show. But you're right, this is a criticism. This is something that's definitely, being addressed by members of the press. I mean, everybody wants her to have an open press conference in which she's going to address some of the topics that you brought up. But, also more importantly, I think it's also an opportunity for her to establish more of a presence and an introduction to the press even about who she is and what she stands for and what she wants to do if she becomes president. Now, the interesting part of all of this is that what we're focused on right now is the next big event, and that's going to be the September presidential debate between her and Donald Trump. And I think that's going to be an interesting moment. That's going to be the thing that everybody looks to next to sort of hear from her and really get an understanding of where she is and what she stands for. And so I think, the time is of the essence. As I mentioned in the last question, we're really in a short and narrow window before balloting begins. And then obviously the election is just so many days away. So her opportunity to address these concerns and get in front of the press is also on a ticking clock as well.
Kane, what would be the possible wisdom behind Kamala's choice for running mate, Tim Walz?
Well, I think right now, maybe you've seen the viral moment, too, of Tim Walz's son, Gus, at the Democratic National Convention, pointing up on the stage and saying, that's my dad, and, is very emotionally overcome by that moment. I think that is probably a part of the entire wisdom of having him as the running mate. He is a relatable person to a lot of people in the American Midwest. He's a football coach, a basketball coach. He's a military veteran. He's a family guy. He's a teacher. He's a popular governor in Minnesota. Minnesota is also a neighboring state to Wisconsin. Wisconsin is a battleground state. There was some thought, President Trump made a campaign appearance in Minnesota before President Biden exited the race. And there was some hope on the Republican side that perhaps the Republicans might be able to pick up Minnesota on the electorate map. But that's all obviously changed since the dynamic of the race has changed. And so I think that there is a lot of wisdom in his choice. It's clear that he's going to appeal to a large segment of voters that perhaps Vice President Harris wouldn't otherwise reach. He's also someone who has some experience in politics. He's a former congressman. He's the current governor of Minnesota. He's also established great relationships across the aisle also, too. He's been known to work with his fellow Republican lawmakers across the aisle. And so, I think that he kind of brings the entire package to the Democratic ticket for the Democrats. And, I think also, too, you can see, as I mentioned before, that viral moment during the DNC. That's probably now the most talked about moment during the entire week.
Okay, last question. In the 2020 race for the White House, it ended with Joe Biden getting 306 electoral votes and Trump 223, nearly identical to the 304 Trump won in 2016 against Hillary's in 2016. But some 43,000 votes, 42,908 to be exact, was the cumulative difference in the states of Georgia, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Kind of razor thin, I must admit. Okay, tell me honestly, do you think the difference in November will be even closer?
I don't think that at least those amounts will be the same. I mean, again, it's going to be close. These are the states that determine the outcome of the election. But I think that there's a different atmosphere now. There's a different choice. There's the choice between former President Donald Trump and current Vice President Kamala Harris. And I think that previous to President Biden exiting the race, there was this sense of history repeating itself. This was going to be a rematch of the 2020 election. And there's a lot of people out there that wanted a different choice. There's a lot of people out there that wanted something different. I think all of the polling on a lot of these surveys showed that what Americans were most displeased about was this was the choice that they had. They wanted a better option. They wanted better options to choose from. And so now there are different options out there. The question is, are Americans happy with the choices they have, and how will that result in voter turnout? It's interesting to note, too, when we talk about those razor-thin margins, the last election in 2020 also saw a record amount of voters turn out. It was the highest amount either candidate from either party had ever received in a presidential election. The question will be, how will turnout be this time around, and will it create those razor-thin margins, or will it help there be more disparity between the two candidates when the final tally comes in? I think that the thing to look for, though, is that Vice President Kamala Harris actually has now several options to win the White House, whereas it was very narrow for Joe Biden to do so. Right now, she can win by, securing Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. She's also put North Carolina in play. She also is very competitive in Arizona and Nevada. And it looks like she's competitive now in Florida. And also, she's narrowed the gap in a state like Texas, which is, has leaned heavily Republican. But even while she might not win Texas, it looks as if the race between current Republican Senator Ted Cruz and his Democratic challenger, Allred, that race is narrowing. And her being at the top of the ticket might actually help these down ballot races do well in both the House races and the Senate races. So, all of this is going to depend on turnout, however, and I think that is the ultimate question that we're looking to see answered when we see those final votes tallied in November.
All right, thanks for sharing your insights and joining us on the show. Kane Farabaugh reporting live from Illinois. Thanks again.
Thank you.
And here are the results of tonight's multi-million peso lotto draws from the PCSO.
Good evening, Lotto players.